Hi, so it's Sam, and I'm ready to present my English 16 final, and I baked a cake. And so I think this was a really cool way to build on that idea that we've discussed all quarter of exploring different multimodal forms of presenting our literature. So what I'll be talking about today is the Mestiza consciousness, and to kick that off, I want to start with a quote from Cristina Ramirez, who says that Mestiza rhetoric emerges from a place of suspension between cultural identities. A Mestiza consciousness, which does not necessarily mean that the writer considers herself to be from an indigenous background, but that she is able to conceptualize a different reality of herself and her behavior, making an ontological shift. So what I really want to emphasize from that quote is that idea of coming from a place of suspension between identities. That's really what the Mestiza consciousness is all about, and something that I've dealt with personally as a person who has a Mestiza consciousness coming from both a Dominican and a white background. And so to explore this notion further, I'm going to start with my base layer and looking to the biggest detail on this layer. It's this decoration right here, which is essentially just land. It's just two people on land. And the reason I included this is because Ramirez talks a lot about the idea of land when it comes to a Mestiza consciousness. Because a person with a Mestiza consciousness, it's not as simple as looking back to a place to identify with, because largely those places are subject to colonialism and conquestialism that resulted in the mixing of a lot of cultures, which becomes the root for that Mestiza, that mix, right? So I wanted to include that to talk a little bit about that and what Ramirez has to say about that. So it's difficult to just connect to something. It's difficult for me to just look back and say, oh, right, the Dominican Republic, that's where I'm from. It's not that simple, because I have roots both with the indigenous population, which has its own culture, and I have roots from those who came from Spain as well, which is a totally separate culture. So there's that European side and that Dominican side, which convolutes itself when it comes to education, which brings us to this next tier. And you can't see the other side, but it says huérfanos, and it says somos huérfanos, which is a quote from Ansel Duell, who talks about this, and the reason she says that, and in English this means we are orphans. And the reason that she says this is because you kind of do feel like an orphan when you have a Mestiza consciousness, in the sense that you are suspended between all these cultures, so you don't feel particularly tied to one, or you don't feel like you can just reach out and grab something and say, this is my identity, because there are so many different parts that are calling to you. And so that's why I thought it was important to include this quote from Borderlands, Ansel Duell's work, and it kind of ties into something that the article Para la Mujer said, which was it talked about that notion of when you have these different identities that are speaking to you, the power, there are oftentimes writing, in this article it said that writing has the power to shape identities. And so it's incredibly important to find your own voice when it comes to writing then, because it has the power to shape identities. However, when those with the Mestiza consciousness struggle with it, it's difficult to do that, to find your voice and allow writing to take on that identity. And so that's something that Para la Mujer talks about, as well as the problematic nature of what happens when somebody has more difficulty connecting to that identity, but somebody else who actually isn't a part of that identity, as we see with a lot of Anglo writers who talk about the identities of people of color and therefore misrepresent them. And Para la Mujer goes into that and talks about that and why that's problematic. And I've dealt with this myself as well, not really knowing what part of myself to identify with. Am I Dominican? Am I white? I have walked into a lot of settings where it's like a Latinx student union in high school or something like that, and people asked why I was there. So questioning that and dealing with that is something that I faced throughout my life too. And now we're moving on to the final layer, which, as you see, is very sparkly and shiny. And the thing that I want to point out on the top, there's this rose with a lot of vines. And then we have escribir written on the side, which is to write in Spanish. And we also have Viva la Revolución. And the reason that I'll start with Viva la Revolution, and the reason that we have that has to do with Federley's notions of being a resisting reader. And the reason that we all need to be resisting readers when it comes to both our own works and other works is because those who have a Mestiza consciousness, are living in a society where it's not systematized for those with Mestiza consciousnesses. They're subjugated, and so therefore we need to constantly be questioning the literature around us, knowing that we're coming from a culture that is not rooted in this consciousness. Instead, it is rooted in like an old white man's, to be totally honest. And so so that idea of resisting and revolutionizing, that's something that's really important when you have a Mestiza consciousness, knowing that you're coming into a system that is not systematized or made for you. And then escribir, I want to talk a little bit about Swearinger's article where she talks about composition and very much the idea of having a non-rigid approach to it, which I think is incredibly important to people who have a Mestiza consciousness in the writing process, because our identities are non-rigid. Our identities are very mixed. And so how can we expect to have a rigid process when it comes to our writing? And that's something that Swearinger notes with great emphasis, is not having those binaries and embracing a rich diversity of views that don't necessarily go together, and you don't need to know how they go together, is a big thing that Swearinger points out. You don't have to approach this with intellect. You just have to approach this with a willingness to engage. And I think that's a really big part of the Mestiza consciousness and the writing process for somebody who has the Mestiza consciousness. And lastly, the rose on top. The reason that I have that there is because we're always growing, and that and especially as somebody who comes from a place of mixed identity, you're always growing in the sense of discovering new parts of your identity, discovering where you come from, where you're going, how those relate, and how those relate at the end of the day back to your writing process as we talk about it within the sphere of English 16. And for me personally, I think that means a lot of what Swearinger was talking about with embracing the writing process as not something that is rigid and incredibly complex and difficult to dive into. It really starts with getting into those different viewpoints and embracing them and just sitting with them at the end of the day and reflecting. And that's a great day, and that's a great way to begin your writing process. And so that is it. This is my cake. Thank you so much for listening.